Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar series, which has been broadened to include topics on beef, lamb and goats. It's great to have you on board tonight. My name is Courtney Cheers and I work with the webinar coordinators Holm Sackett. So this series comprises of a total of 30 webinars that will be presented between now and July 2020. These webinars are recorded and can be accessed later on the MLA website. The title for tonight's webinar is Checking Your Cows Are at Optimum Condition This Winter. So I'll just share my screen. Yep. For those of you that aren't familiar with the webinar platform or might just need a refresh, the control panel you can see to your right is able to be opened and closed using the red arrow, so you can enjoy the full screen view without the control panel during the presentation. You should be able to hear us, but we can't hear you, so I'd encourage you to use the question box to communicate any questions you might have during the presentation. Just ask you to make your questions as clear as you can so that we can address them with relevant responses. So tonight we have Paul Nilon presenting our webinar. Paul is a sheep and beef vet production advisor in Tasmania, where he's been working for the last 29 years. He's a graduate of the McKinnon project at Melbourne University and a member of the Australian College of Veterinary Scientists in epidemiology. Paul's special interests are in herd health and production, particularly sheep and beef nutrition at pasture, supplementary feeding, grazing systems, and increasingly grazing under irrigation. We're very fortunate to have Paul presenting this topic tonight. So without further ado, you're happy for me to switch over to you, Paul?
Yeah, if I can find the button.
Yep.
How are we going?
Yes, you should be able to.
Show my screen. Thank you.
That's right.
Right. Okay, we're away, I hope. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all well. A bit cold down here in Tassie, but that's the way it goes. So, oops, there. I've come on one slide too soon. There's always a glitch, isn't there? Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about condition scoring in cattle. What is condition scoring? How to do it with lots of pictures, and I hope an emphasis on doing it visually rather than doing it hands-on like we do with sheep. I'm going to talk briefly about the uses of condition scoring, and that can include general nutritional planning, a little bit of talk about reproduction, and we'll finish up with some talking about minimal animal welfare standards and how you can use condition scoring for that. And that's probably the most important thing, particularly given that large areas of the cattle herd are in drought. And anything that we don't cover, please feel free to ask questions. Okay, so some opening comments. Why this topic? Well, apart from the fact that I was asked to do it, the fact is that in my experience, the use of condition scoring in cattle, and in fact how to do it, is really poorly understood in comparison with sheep, because the sheep industries have had the people delivering the lifetime ewe management systems for the last 10 or so years, so that the message is getting through, even if condition scoring in sheep is not used as widely as it is in cattle. As I've said, I want to put a particular emphasis on how to do it and how to do it visually, and not so much on what uses we can put it to, but we will mention that in the end. Most of this information is drawn from MLA and Zoetis's Ramping Up Repro programs, but a lot of the pictures are ones that I've taken over the years, so thanks to Zoetis and MLA for providing a lot of the background material. And because I'm a Tasmanian, then I tend to think in terms of southern high rainfall, but the options that are available for people to use condition scoring information in the pastoral zone are going to be radically different to what they are down here. But the basic techniques of condition scoring remain the same and should be used more widely. Okay, so what is condition scoring? It's an assessment of an animal's body condition based on the estimated fat reserves in certain body parts. So we can regard that as a measure of the animal's metabolic fuel tank, how much it's got left to draw down in times of nutritional shortfall, and also what nutritional reserves are needed to meet certain reproductive and other functions. The great thing about body condition scoring is that the information that you get is independent of the size of the animal. So in that regard, it's much more useful than weight alone, unless you're in a position to track the weights of individual animals fairly closely. Having said that, it's really only useful in animals, well, in the case of cattle, over about 15 months of age. So when it comes to things like deciding on which heifers you're going to make, you're still better off to use live weight rather than body condition scores, and that also applies to sheep as well. I'm sure you know that. Just so there's no confusion, I hope you understand the difference between condition scores and carcass fat scores. So carcass fat scores are methods of grading cattle at the point of sale, not actually assessing the nutritive reserves for hard times. So most times that carcass fat scores are brought into play, they've got plenty of reserves there. And for most of our European cattle, Bos Indicus probably a bit less, but European cattle, one condition score in an adult cow can be somewhere between about 50 and 80 kilograms in live weight, obviously depending on the frame size of the cattle. So if you are in a situation where they are in high nutritional stress and high metabolic need, they could be losing 2 kilos a day, and that translates to one whole condition score in the course of a month. Just maybe keep that thought in mind. Right, so just so that we are all clear, there's a chart from the MLA's cattle carcass scoring system, and so they're really concerned about things like the P8 site and the 12th, 13th rib site. The stuff that we're dealing with here tonight is much more general. Righto. So that begs the question, why condition scores are important. And just a few brief points. The first thing is it's the key indicator of a cow's reproductive performance. So if you want them to both lactate strongly and get back in calf, you've got to meet certain minimum targets. And we're going to talk to that briefly later in the presentation. It is the starting point for managing feed requirements when there are shortfalls. So, first of all, do you need supplementary feeding? How much do you need? And how much can you let the cattle slip, if that's a consideration? Or in some cases, how much do you need to bring them up to meet the required? I guess third point is really a repeat of the first point, but patently your calving dates are going to be pretty much determined by matching it to pasture availability, amongst other things, but that's probably the big one. And cattle with at least some reserves of energy are going to be more resistant to nutritional shortfalls and other stresses as well. Right, so some do's and don'ts on condition scoring before we get into it. All of the storybooks tell us that we should do this hands-on, and that's exactly how we have to do it with sheep. If you try to condition score sheep without doing it hands-on, you're on a hiding to nothing. But it is nowhere near as convenient to yard cattle to do it with any regularity. So what I'd like to do tonight, and I guess this is the big part of the presentation, is to give you some pointers on how to do it visually. It's really important that you do numbers of cattle. If you sort of just do one or two, then your eyes are going to be drawn to the heavy ones in the mob, and you're going to go away with a false impression. For your own records, and also you know, to keep inquisitive people who might be looking over the fence at arm's length, it's really important that you record your results. Now, there are condition scoring apps available for your iPhone. They're mostly designed for sheep, but that's fine. You can the system's no different in cattle, or you can use a graph, or you can just write it down in your elder's book. It doesn't really matter, but please keep a record. In terms of sort of getting good results, we urge clients here to use binoculars when they're out in the paddock. And that means that they can study cattle without having them move off all the time. And if you use a phone camera, or any camera for that matter, you can record those results and send them off to your advisor, and he can pass judgment on where you need to be and what's happening with the mob if you're not confident yourself. It's really important, if cattle are being supplemented, that they are scored before they get a belly full of hay. Because if their rumens sort of start to bulge out underneath the short ribs, then you're going to get a completely false impression of what's going on. And we've got a couple of pictures to demonstrate that shortly. Now, the condition scoring system that we're going to describe is the 1 to 5 system. If you're bored with the football and you actually go looking for this sort of thing, you'll find systems from 1 to 4 to 1 to 10 for different parts of the world. In fact, at one stage, I think MLA even had a 1 to 6 system on their website, but I can't find it now. So 1 to 5, it's roughly in line with what we do for sheep. It's certainly robust enough for our purposes. Just be careful that other people do use other systems, and particularly the dairy people and a lot of the animal welfare advisors and operatives for the government tend to use the 1 to 8 system, which was derived for the dairy cattle industry. And you can do some conversions, but 1 to 5 is pretty robust. Now, in reality, we're really only interested in condition score 3.5. So with the exception of diseases and conditions that are caused by being oversized, all of the action occurs at condition score 3.5. The other comment I'd make about that is that, you know, the top condition score that we grade is condition score 5, but condition score 5 cow is fat. There's no condition score 6, so condition score 5 cow might be fat or super fat. So at the top end, at least, it's open-ended. At the bottom end, the cows are dead. Okay, so this is a Reproductive photo. Why they chose to use a photo of the biggest, fattest cows in history to give you the critical points, I'm not quite sure, but we'll overcome that in a moment. Despite all of the points there that we're worried about, the two that I'd particularly like to make mention of, differentiation between the hooks and the pins. So the hooks are the forward part of the pelvis, and the pins are at the back of the pelvis there, or as the cyclist would tell us, our sit bones. You also need to be aware of the line of the spine and the short ribs, but we'll show you a better picture of the short ribs in a moment. I'm sure you're all familiar with this anyway. Okay, if you've got an opportunity to feel them, then in fact what you're feeling is the amount of coverage between the top of the spine and the edge of the short ribs. And feeling it's a good way to get your eye in, but it's in my opinion, it's not absolutely essential. Right, so we'll start off with the hands-on method, which is straight out of the Reproductive stuff. And condition score 1 cattle. Well, in fact, I'm not quite sure I've ever seen a condition score 1 cow up and alive. If they're less than condition score 1.5, their existence is pretty parlous. But yeah, just as a side, the backbones are prominent. The hips and the shoulders stand out like there's no tomorrow. You can see the line of the ribs. I'm sorry, the line of the scapula, the shoulder bone, and it actually appears as if you can get your hands around each rib. The point I'd make is, in fact, that condition score less than 1.5 is really unacceptable, and the chances are the cows are either in a very parlous state or dead. Okay, if we move on to condition score 2, which is in the south, at least, probably the bottom end of where you want to be most of the time. If you start to drop below condition score 2, your margin for problems is really, really small. So you can still see the line of the backbone quite easily. The hips and the shoulder bones are definitely visible, particularly the hips. The shoulder is, well, less visible. You can't see the whole of the spine of the shoulder. The ribs you can still see as individual entities. Don't worry about the tail head. That's something that dairy farmers tend to get very excited about. But the outline of the body still looks pretty bony. Right, condition score 3. Short ribs, you can still see the line of the short ribs, but you can only feel them with fairly firm thumb pressure. The hip bones are still visible, particularly the front of the hip bones. The ribs may or may not be visible, just depending on whether the cows have been fed or not. As I said, don't worry about the tail head area. And the body outline is pretty smooth. Okay, so I think that's where we end our view through what the storybooks tell us about condition scoring. And I'd like to go over to a series of photos that I've taken over a few years to try and make this a visual job. So as I said, we need to do it when the cattle are empty, a range of cattle, take pictures, use aids, and we're only interested in the condition score less than 3.5. Right. Now, here, in my opinion, is a much better specimen to look at in terms of finding some landmarks. Right, so they're the short ribs. I'm sure you knew that. And this poor old beast, you've got no trouble counting individual short ribs. You might notice there that between the ends of the short ribs and the top of the spine, it is really hollowed out. And up here in the forward part of the this beast's carcass, you can actually see what we call the L bracket, and I'm going to come back to that. The hook bones, the forward part of the pelvis, that's standing out like there's no tomorrow. You know, you wouldn't want to use that as a saddle, would you? Rump muscles, again, another really good visual fixateur in the paddock. And last but not least are the pin bones, which in fact that arrow is about 0.5 centimetre too high. So the pin bones are actually down around here. And one of the things is that once you get much above condition score 3, they disappear. And then as you get down to condition score 2 and less, you can actually see 3 distinct bumps there. So that's a pretty good citer for what you're seeing in the paddock. This area here around the base of the tail, beloved of dairy farmers, not as important in my opinion for beef cattle. Right, so my starting point is condition score 3 because we can work up and down from that. At condition score 3, the line of the spine is visible, but only just. So you can see it as a hairline, and there might be a slight fall down to the musculature, but not much at all. The lumbar muscles are flat. So by that I mean, in fact, the area between the line of the spine and the end of the short ribs doesn't appear to be either concave or convex. It looks pretty flat. What's happening here? There we go. The line at the end of the short ribs is visible, but generally speaking, individual short ribs are not visible unless the animals are severely dehydrated or they've been off in a feed curfew for quite some time. Now, the hook bones are fairly prominent, you know, from the front, but rounded from the back. And so when it comes to good landmarks, I look at the hook bones, how sort of sharpish they are, and the line of the spine. They're the two. I'm sorry, the flat muscle. So they're the two things that we're particularly concerned with. And the pin bones are just a bump. Okay, so this is our good condition score 3 cow standing in a pretty ordinary paddock. But just to reiterate, if I can get my cursor going, you can see that the hook bones, they're pretty prominent from the front, but they're well and truly rounded from the back. The lumbar muscles, that's actually quite variable. This one's a bit sunken, but she's she's not actually wilted away all that much. You can easily see the line of the spine, and this muscle in here, the lumbar muscles are pretty flat. So you've got a bit of a sort of initial drop down from the line of the spine, but then after that it's fairly flat. And in this case, because she's been in curfew for a while, you can actually see some ribs. You can't see much on the front end of the beast of any concern, and there's the pin bone there, which is a bump which you can still see fairly easily, but you can't see the individual parts of that. Right, just very briefly, if you want to go above, at condition score 3.5, the pin bones just about disappear, so they're gone. You can't really see the line of the short ribs. The hooks are visible as bumps, but they don't even appear all that prominent from the front, let alone the back. At condition score 4, the hooks are just about gone, and bulges of fat begin to appear around the base of the tail. But if you're consistently running your cattle at condition score 3.5 or above, you're probably understocked if it's occurring year in, year out. And you, in this part of the world at least, you're also in with the possibility of grass tetany. Okay, so this starling is at least 3.5, probably a bit more. The hook bones you can still see. The line of the ribs, the short ribs, has disappeared. The pin bones, they don't stand out much at all. So she's a good 3.5 and maybe even a little bit more. And here's a mob of heifers, God help us. Just about every one of them viewed from above is well above the 3.5 mark. So these poor guys are probably going to be in for a bit of a hiding when it comes to delivering the calves. Or maybe they were the empties, I can't remember. Okay, this is the more important part. What happens when you start to go below condition score 3? So condition score 2.5, you can see the individual short ribs, particularly if the cows have been in curfew from gut-filling feed. The lumbar muscles, so the muscles between the ends of the short ribs and the top of the spine, start to become distinctly concave. You can actually see the bump of the pin bones quite distinctly, even in the paddock, and particularly using your binoculars. The hook bones are reasonably prominent front and rear, but particularly from the front. Okay, so here's our 2.5 or maybe a little bit more. I've got to say at this juncture, in fact, that I've just about seen people come to blows about whether a cow is 2.5 or 2.6. It really doesn't matter. If you can get it within a quarter of a condition score, you're going to be absolutely fine. So you can see this cow's been off feed for a while. The hook bones are particularly prominent. You've got no trouble seeing, and certainly if you've got access to it, feeling the short ribs. Importantly, start to note that even from the rear, the hook bones are looking fairly sharpish, and the lumbar muscles, the rump muscles here, are really starting to fall away, and you can just about draw a bead on the pin bones because they're quite prominent. Now here's a collection of 3 cows that are sort of 2.5-ish plus a bit down to 2.5-ish less a bit. So this darling here at the front is probably 2.5 and a bit. You can see the short ribs hooks, lots of muscle wastage over this area, and back there are the pin bones. The cow in the middle is probably the lightest of the three, and because these cows have been curfewed from feed, it makes the whole condition scoring process a whole heap easier. And the one at the back, well, we can't really see much enough about that one to make too much comment. Condition score 2 is where we really start to get a bit worried. The short ribs are easily visible, and if you can feel them, you've got no problem feeling them. You can easily get your fingers down at least a short way in between them. The hooks are sharp front and rear. The muscles are really distinctly concave, and particularly that's the rump muscles, or the lumbar, yeah, and the lumbar muscles, but particularly the rump muscles. And by condition score 2, you can sometimes, in fact, mostly you can see 2 distinct points on the pin bones. Now, sadly, this is my condition score 2 cow. So even from above there, you can see that there's a lot of concavity in those muscles there, the lumbar muscles, and certainly these rump muscles as well. If we were in a position to view this darling from the front, then it would be just about, you know, the Matterhorn or something like that. It's so steep on the front, and the pin bones are starting to stick out here. You'll have to take my word that if you can feel that cow, you'd have no trouble at all seeing two prominent points there. Now, condition score 1.5 is the lower end of what's acceptable, and whether it's acceptable depends on the cow's physiological state. So the ends of the short ribs by this stage appear flat and sharp. Individual short ribs are easily visible from above and from the side, a really important marker. You can easily see the individual dorsal spines, by which I mean that's the dorsal spine is the line of the spine, and the individual backbone joints or vertebra, you can actually see down between them. And by 1.5, you can see 3 distinct bumps on the pins. The muscles, of course, because all the fat has gone and the muscles themselves are starting to atrophy, muscles are really concave. So here are some signs that you might decide to pull the HF handle. If you think you can get your hand around each rib, I'm not talking about the short ribs, we're talking about the ribs on the chest. So if you reckon the ribs are so distinct that you can put your fingers in there and get them around, you've got a very light cow. The so-called L bracket effect. Now, by that I mean when you look at it from above and behind particularly, but even from the side, if the muscles over the lumbar area and forward towards the shoulder are so atrophied that they look like all you've got left is an L bracket of bone. The line of the shoulder bone is easily visible. So, you know, it's not just you can see the shoulder, you can frequently see the shoulder, but that spine that runs down the middle of the shoulder bone, excuse me, is quite easily visible. And you can see the point of the hip and the line of the thigh bone. So any of those things, and you're in deep strife, or your cow's in deep strife. So this is our much photographed super light cow. It's really about 1.5 or a little bit more, but she hasn't got much in the way of reserves, and if memory serves me, she actually was in calf, this one, so she's in a power strife. But you can see the individual ribs here. You can just about get your hand around them. Up here, you can see this L bracket effect that I'm talking about. There's absolutely no tissue left here at all. It's all withered away. The hook bones are particularly sharp, and it doesn't show it from this point of view, but if you stood behind her, you could just about convince yourself that there are 3 distinct points there. Okay, so that's the system that I use, and I hope it's pretty, you know, reproducible. There are some difficulties because individual cows, some sort of seem to lose muscle in the rump and others lose it up here. But, you know, look for multiple features, but pay particular attention to the hooks, the line of the short ribs, and these muscular areas here. They're the telltale signs. Okay, so you've gone out and you've condition scored your cattle. What use can you put the information to? Now, this section is going to be fairly short because it wasn't the main purpose. The main purpose was just to describe a system. If you ring me up at the start of winter and say that you've got this amount of such and such a supplementary feed on hand, and how much should you feed, then I'm going to be a little bit cranky with you, because in fact the fundamental piece of information that is missing is what's their body condition score, because depending on what it is and when they're going to calve, and what the seasonal prospects are, will really make a huge difference to the answer that I might give you. And even small differences in condition can make a big difference to the recommendations. So if you say to me, yeah, they look pretty good, or no, they look a bit light, that's about as handy as a glass eye at a keyhole. So if you're going to use me as an advisor, then make sure you condition score them. Okay, so if we've got sort of a half a condition score difference between 2 3/4 and 3 3/4, you know, three options that might come up in a spring mating herd are do nothing versus supplement. So if you're close to 3.25 and you want to keep your supplements for later in the season or for another class of livestock, then at 3.25, do nothing might well be an option. For a spring calving herd, if you're 2 3/4, 2.75, then in fact you might have the option of feeding a low quality supplement, so something like hay, as opposed to a high quality supplement, which is usually a grain-based or at least a very, very good silage. And of course, you've also got the option of splitting the mob to preferentially feed the lighter ones. But the point is that any nutritional planning starts with condition scores, what feeds you've got on hand, and also what supplements you might have going forward. It's having made scant measure of the fact that cows can be too fat, except to sort of abuse people to say that if you're consistently above 4, you're understocked. Is there an issue with cows being too fat? And the answer is yes. Firstly, of course, if they are consistently condition score 4 and above at the critical times of the year, then you probably are understocked. But the equally important thing is that at least in southern areas, so here in Tasmania, large areas of Victoria, particularly south of the range, and on the slopes of New South Wales, in fact, all up and down the tablelands in New South Wales as well, those overweight cattle are going to be really vulnerable to grass tetany. So the best way to combat grass tetany, in fact, is to run your cows that little bit harder so that they're not looking like they're candidates for Jenny Craig. The one that attracts all of the attention is using condition score to predict and get a better reproductive performance. And there's no doubt about it that condition score is the best predictor of the strength of lactation and therefore your weaning weight and also the conception rate. So in this part of the world, in the deep south, adult cows, if you consistently want better than a 90% conception from a 9-week mating, then you're going to need a condition score 3 in the autumn and 2.5 in spring at the point of calving to be able to guarantee that. So there's a couple of ballparks that you can work on. It never ceases to amaze me that when we're out preg testing and the results are disappointing, people are immediately sort of talking about all sorts of rare and wonderful things like selenium deficiency, perhaps infectious diseases like vibriosis, when 8, maybe 9 times out of 10, the information is already in front of them. So, you know, it's the fact that those animals were too light at the point of joining. Heifers, so that's the heifers that have calved down. Pardon me. These are a really difficult class to get back in calf. You don't need me to tell you that. So probably condition score 3.25 for the autumn mating mobs, and 3 and a bit at joining for the spring calving mobs, just in the hope that the spring will take them away a bit. So it raises the prospect, in fact, that if you've got condition scores in front of you, it gives you the opportunity to act on them. Now, exactly what action you take is going to be determined by what your seasonal expectations are, which you know, forward predictions are getting better and better. They're not perfect, but they are getting better. Plus the price of supplement, plus the price of or the price that's going to be received for the product at the end of the day. So, you know, in some years, if you had them at 2.5, you'd be absolutely thanking your lucky stars and probably wouldn't be in a position to supplement. Other years, for example, here in Tasmania this year, because of good prices and an extraordinary hay season, we can probably afford to supplement them a bit more. A final point on reproductive performance is to talk about first pregnancy. Pretty much regardless of when you calve, you don't want them calving down at more than about 3.5. So if at preg testing, which I hope is done nice and early, they are looking fairly beefy, make sure one way or the other you get some weight off them before you're down to 3.5. But if you drop them below 2, below 3 at the point of calving, particularly with an autumn calving, you're going to have God's own trouble getting them back up to a higher plane of nutrition to get them back in calf. Okay, now I'm sure that many of you watched the Landline report last weekend about the conflict between animal welfare activists and vegans and farmers. This is not a problem that's going to go away. It's going to get worse and worse, and that's pretty much regardless of the brand of government that's in office. So let's just talk briefly about some minimum standards for the really hard times. So if you have late pregnant and lactating animals at condition score equal or less than 2, they're in grave danger of dying, particularly if they're lactating. So unless the prospects of the season are great, and usually if they're down at that level, they're not, you've got to act with high energy supplements immediately. Otherwise, you're going to have deaths. I mean, you know, regardless of sort of being prepared to say that you're going to wean off manky calves, that's not the consideration. You're going to have deaths and people are going to be looking over the fence. If you have dry cows or older bullocks that have in drought times or hard times slipped, but they're not lactating and they're obviously not pregnant, if you can let them go down to condition score 1.5, but once they get to 1.5, that's pretty much the bottom line, and even sort of quite minor checks at condition score 1.5 can cause unacceptable consequences. So in this day and age, it's not acceptable to have people say, well, we're going to put them in the back paddock and they're going to take their chances. I mean, particularly here in the southern states, that's just not going to rub anymore. You need to be proactive in your condition scoring and acting on your findings. So depending on your class of stock and their stage of pregnancy or lactation, you really should start crunching the numbers pretty carefully once they get down to 2 1/4 and 2 is the bottom line for action, unless they happen to be adult dry cattle, in which you've got another half condition score. But, you know, the sooner you act, the more chance you've got of a good result. And it's not just a matter of saying, oh, well, we're going to feed them, because that mightn't be an option. But if you let them drop below condition score 2 and they're late pregnant or lactating, or condition score 1.5, you're going to be stopped from trucking them off to another part of the country. So condition score early and act early on your findings. The last point I'd like to raise in the body of the talk is, what do you do if you get a visit from the animal welfare authorities? And here in Tasmania, it's happening more and more frequently. And I don't think that we're the most authoritarian state when it comes to these sort of things, but it's quite surprising how frequently I'm called to comment on them. The first part of your defence is going to be your body condition records, including pictures. So if you've got good, accurate and supportable body condition records, and they say that those animals are are better than 2, you're not necessarily up and running, but at the very least, you've got a leg to stand on. Now, of course, the thing that needs to go with that is your feeding records, and also any feed tests. So it's no point in sort of saying, yeah, but I'm feeding this much hay, if the hay is really, well, to quote a friend of mine, a shit sandwich without the bread. So you need your feeding records, how much you're feeding them, and what that quality feed is. And with that information, provided it's accurate, and particularly the body condition scores, you can ward off a lot of concerns. If, on the other hand, they've already slipped, and particularly if they're going down, you're going to have a very, very harrowing time in front of you. Okay, so that's the guts of the talk tonight. Just to recap, condition scoring is the best way to assess adult cattle's metabolic reserves. While in the best of all possible worlds, we'd be feeling them, you can do it with some provisos visually, and the more you do it, the better you're going to become at it. And finally, use condition scorers for general nutritional planning to optimize your reproductive weights, and perhaps most importantly of all, to prevent animal welfare catastrophes. So that's me, Courtney.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for that, Paul. That was very informative, and it was good to hear some really practical ways that we can condition score with a system that we can refer to make it really simple and so we can use it regularly. So thanks. Just some housekeeping. Some people might have to duck off early before we can get to some questions, and if that's the case, if you could just fill out the survey as you exit, that would be really useful. The survey is going to be shared with both MLA and the presenters, which will help with improving extension efforts and making sure that we're targeting the right topics that are relevant to you. I also just want to mention that we have another webinar that's planned in 2 weeks' time on the 20th of June, and the topic for that will be the role of vaccination in prevention and controlling pneumonia in sheep and cattle, which will be presented by Ben Lynn from the McKinnon Project. So it'd be really great if you could tune into that. So just to let everyone know, if you weren't there at the start, you can ask any questions in the chat box on your control panel, and then I will ask Paul and he can answer. But I'll just kick off some questions now. So Paul, I'm wondering, is this technique, this scale, is it applicable to all breeds and across Bos Indicus and Bos Taurus breeds?
Look, my experience has been mostly with Bos taurus, being here in the south. We discourage things with too many skin folds. It is generally, in my estimation, it is generally applicable to Bos indicus cattle, except for the fact that they just generally appear to be more angular. Okay, so the prominence of the hook bones in particular, you know, you might need to de-emphasize that a little bit. But having said that, once you get below that sort of 2.5 level, all of the same cardinal signs are there. So, you know, you really start to see hollowing out of the musculature over the lumbar area between the short ribs and the spine, and also the musculature around the rump. And at condition score 2, you know, all of the things that we talked about, the prominence of the short ribs, and the capacity to see and get your fingers between them, etc., etc. They're all there. It's just, you know, individual animals within herds as well. So those red cattle that we showed the picture of the 3 cows, they're Bos taurus cattle, but they're a bit more like what I would expect some Bos indicus cattle to be.
Yeah, okay. No, that's great. Thank you. So Ron's just sent in a question, and he's wondering what the percentage is of a mob that you need to record.
Okay. Look, there's no simple answer to that, but obviously it depends a little bit on mob size as well. But what I would urge you to do is actually make the conscious effort to condition score at the lower end of the herd. Now, that's particularly the case when the condition scores are getting down to 2.5 and less. If you concentrate on the lower end of the herd and get a good handle on what the light ones are, you're going to be in a much better position to act competently than if you're just sort of doing a small number. If you want to use information on, you know, sort of to do something like split feeding, so, you know, draft off the heavy ones and preferentially feed the lighter ones, then patently you just about need to do the whole herd. But look, if you're starting to do any numbers, you get pretty good at it fairly quickly. The other comment that I'd pass is that I think it's human nature that when you go into the herd, because they're your cattle, you tend to pick on or your eye tends to light on the ones that are actually at the better end of the scale. When the animal welfare or the other harsh critics come into the herd, they're going to be picking on, taking pictures of, and haranguing you about the ones at the lighter end of the herd. So if you put your efforts into the lighter end of the herd, you're going to be in a much stronger position to act appropriately to keep the gremlins at bay.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that, Paul. So Kylie's just asked, why are heavier cows more susceptible to grass tetany?
Don't know. Look, I'm sure somebody knows. The 3 determinants of likelihood of grass tetany are basically age, breed. So the more likely that a breed is a strong lactator, the more likely that they're going to get grass tetany, and body condition. Now, when I worked on the Southern Tablelands in New South Wales, which is a long time ago, long before Leonard Teal left homicide, you know, we used to have all of our cows calving down in condition score 4, and that was regarded as being, you know, a really good sign. You know, you're a good manager, you're not stressing the stock. And then we go out and we see whole paddocks full of them dead after a cold front had moved through. So, look, short answer is I don't know, but keep in mind the 3 determinants: age, breed and body condition, and the fact that if you have cattle at less than condition score 3.5, then the risk of grass tetany goes way, way down, even in quite high risk years.
Yep, okay, thanks, Paul. So Jane is asking, how applicable is condition scoring to heavily pregnant cows?
Oh, it's absolutely applicable. The issue with heavily pregnant cows, so the last, the last month or 6 weeks, is that the expansion of the uterus in the abdominal cavity makes it more difficult. So it's a really good question. I should have made more of that. So, in fact, condition scoring cows in late pregnancy is a little bit like trying to condition score them just after they've had a gut full of hay. So what you need to be concentrating on is the area behind the hook bones, because the front of the hook bones are going to look fairly rounded because the cow's belly is pushing out, and the amount of muscle wastage or hollowness on the rump and over the lumbar muscles. So the technique is absolutely applicable, but it is more difficult because the pregnancy makes them look like they've got a gut full of feed.
Okay, yep, makes sense. So Ron is wondering, he's speculating that every mob is going to have a condition score range of at least one condition score. So
yes.
What's acceptable without having to split feed?
Oh, look, again, my suggestion is to look at the bottom end, the bottom 25%. If you've got any number of cattle that are, depending on the stage of pregnancy or lactation and what the seasonal outlook is, if you've got any number of cattle pretty much at all that are less than 2.5, the alarm bells should be starting to sort of just jingle, and by the time they get to 2.25 or approaching 2, they really should be ringing loudly. So, it really depends on exactly what the situation is. But yeah, look at the bottom end of the herd again, and that 2.25 to 2.5 is the critical thing. Now, if in fact you're looking at something different, so you're looking at what your reproductive performance is going to be like going forward, and you've got 75% of your cattle at 2.5 to 2 3/4 for spring calvers at the point of calving or into lactation, you're absolutely swimming.
Okay.
Does that help?
It certainly should, I think. So Bruce is wondering, is there any research being done towards developing an automated condition score system for cattle?
The answer is I don't know. The likelihood is that it wouldn't be desperately difficult. My question is that, well, my suggestion would be that an automated system would probably, rely on having them either yarded and passing underneath some sort of sensor, or perhaps some remote sensor in the paddock. And I reckon that with even modest training, most people's inbuilt sensors, their eyes, are going to be as good.
Okay, yeah. So I have another question. I'm wondering, can we let the condition scores fluctuate much during the year, or is it easier to maintain a standard condition score for a mob?
Yep. Energetically, it's much easier to maintain condition score. So if you have condition score 3, for argument's sake, and you let them drop to 2.5 or maybe a bit below, and then you've got to actually raise it back up, that's going to take a lot more supplementation than if you keep them at condition score 3. Having said that, if the seasonal outlook is reasonable and the price of feed is high in particular, and they've got good condition score to start with, the vast majority of my clients would be letting them go up and down, but that's predicated on the likelihood of a good average season, so that they can actually get back up to the condition score without having to bring in the feed cart. And there are some situations where we're specifically directing people to let their cattle go, and I guess the two that we've already mentioned are, if you've got great big fat cattle, they're at high risk of grass tetany. So if in some way you can knock the condition score off, you're going to reduce their risk of grass tetany. And of course, the other one that we mentioned was that we really don't want our first calvers going down in much more than condition score 3.5 or even a bit less. And of course, that's always going to be a juggling act, because you don't want to be having to pull 45 kilo calves out of heifers that have got fat deposited in their pelvis. But then if you've got them so light that they're easy calvers, they're going to be desperately difficult to get back in calf. So that's a long-winded answer, which may not answer your question, but I hope it does.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Paul. So Brad sent in a question. He's just describing a scenario I assume he's got going on at the moment. So he's got 3-year-old cows. They're second time calving. Currently at a 2.75 score, calving in the southern tablelands in about 4 weeks. He's considering for the 6 weeks leading up to calving to introduce barley at 1.5 kilograms a day to maintain. Cows are going to lose 0.25 of a condition score in the next 6 weeks without supplement. So his question is the calf going to grow too big if he introduces his supplement now, or should he be waiting until calving starts?
Look, the short answer is probably not. So it's good that he's got the condition score there. 1.5 kilos of barley is not a whole lot of barley. So we're talking, roughly, what are we talking, 25 megajoules. That's not a whole lot of additional energy. And so, some of that's, there's no doubt that the fetus takes a little bit of that, but they're 3-year-old cattle. They're not heifers. You're not going to blow the top off them. The only additional comment that I'd pass about that is that, well, first of all, good on you for feeding grain. I wish we could do it here in Tassie, but a lot of the time the producers are signed up to no grain production systems. Regardless of that, if you're going to feed barley efficiently, it does need to be at least lightly hammer milled. So if you can't get it rolled or just lightly crushed, then you really might have to even up it by about another 15 or 20%. But 1.5 kilos is a pretty modest ration for a late pregnant cow.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Paul. So Patrick sent in a question, and he's wondering, will relying on a decreasing condition score up until the point of calving, sort of without any supplementary feeding or feed on offer, will that increase the risk of grass tetany?
No. Look, short answer is that a falling plane of nutrition, in my experience, doesn't seem to increase the risk of grass tetany. So it still comes back to the 3 risk factors that we talked about before, and that is age of the cows. So the older they are, the more at risk they are, the breed, and their absolute body condition score. So in fact, intuitively and experientially, I'd say that if their body condition is actually dropping, that their risk of grass tetany goes down. Now, the issue becomes that you don't want to be using catastrophic drops in body condition score late in pregnancy as a method of trying to control grass tetany per se, because if you start to really rip the weight off them in late pregnancy, then their lactation is going to be poor, firstly. Secondly, and consequentially, their chances of getting back in calf are equally going to be poor. And just depending on what their body condition is, you know, you can start to run into other problems like ketosis and those sort of things. They're pretty rare in beef cattle, but they can occur.
Okay. Yep. Thanks for that, Paul. So I'm just going to sneak in one last question, unless anybody else wants to send one in. On how often should we be condition scoring? Is this something that we should do regularly, once a week, or just at key times during the production cycle?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I probably should have addressed it. Again, it depends on the situation that you faced, but as a sort of a baseline, we're suggesting to clients that they condition score their heifers at preg testing, which for our spring calving system is in the autumn, and that allows them to adjust it up and down to you know, get weight on or get weight off, depending on what their situation is. And then if everything's going okay, the stock standard recommendation is to condition score the cows at the beginning of winter, and then look at the seasonal condition and the seasonal outlook, what reserves, what supplementary reserves you've got on hand, and do some calculations based on that. Now, if in fact you are in a fairly dire predicament and the weight is ripping off the cattle, you really might need to be doing something about once every 10 days to 2 weeks. But if that situation is developing so quickly and you're not acting on it, then condition scoring alone doesn't change a thing. You've really got to act on it. You know, it's quite pointless and disheartening to have people say, oh, well, they're 2.5, so they've still got half a condition score to go before we need to act. And it doesn't matter how frequently you get a condition score. If the weight is falling off them at 1.5 or 2 kilos a day, they'll be at condition score 2 and in a really parlous state long before you can act on it. But yeah, that's the guts of it. Depends a bit on the situation.
Okay, yeah, that seems like really good advice. So thank you for your insight tonight, Paul. We really appreciate it. So that's all the questions that have been sent in. And I'd just like to remind everyone that as you exit, a survey will pop up. So if you could fill that out, it shouldn't take too long. That would be very helpful to us. And don't forget, we have another webinar planned in a couple of weeks' time, talking about the role of vaccination in prevention and control of pneumonia in sheep and cattle. That will be presented by Ben Lynn from the McKinnon Project. So thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Thanks again to Paul. And so I'm going to end the webinar now. Thanks.